Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is John Harkins. I'm the Events Associate for the French American Chamber of Commerce, New York chapter, and we are happy to welcome you to our webinar, COVID-19 in Beijing, Talking Urban Mobility. Just a quick word about our organization. The French American Chamber of Commerce's mission is to provide the opportunities, experiences, and understanding that empower successful business relationships between and for members. The FACC New York chapter counts a mosaic of 1,000 members representing sectors from tech to food, finance, and other professional services. These members have complimentary access to digital events featuring top industry experts and leaders, as well as personalized member-to-member introductions, access to the FACC member directory, and of course, we'll be able to connect with other member attendees of this webinar. In addition, just a quick note on our foundation. The FACC Foundation was created in 2012 to provide scholarships to top French and American students pursuing graduate business degrees on the opposite sides of the Atlantic. Since its inception, 72 young people have benefited from $10,000 merit-based scholarships to attend French and American universities to help create the future leaders of French, American, and global businesses. Just housekeeping on this webinar in particular. This webinar will last about 45 minutes with around a half hour or so of presentation and then time at the end for questions and answers. And of course, this webinar will be recorded and the slides will be available to all attendees, so don't worry about missing a thing. Now, just a quick intro into our topic and our wonderful speakers. As the world reels from the impact of COVID-19, ride-sharing companies must work to ensure customers and employee safety. In this webinar, we will hear from Alicia Veneziani, an FACC Foundation Scholarship winner and strategy manager at Didi, on how the Chinese ride-sharing company has adapted and the key takeaways learned. Alicia lives in Beijing, where she is responsible for international strategy at China's #1 ride-hailing company, Didi. Alicia previously supervised product development at Tesla and Palo Alto, and prior to Tesla, she expanded the clean mobility business line of Air Liquide, a leading chemical company in Asia based out of Shanghai. Alicia is an engineer from AgroParisTech and holds a Master of Economics from IFP School and an MBA from MIT. Alicia is also proudly an FACC Foundation Scholarship Alumna. Now, before I hand it over to Alicia, I gave a very brief intro into our foundation, but I'm going to hand it over to Martin Bischhoff, who will give a better look into the story of the FACC Foundation before giving it over to Alicia. Martin?
Thank you, John. So you gave a great introduction. For those of you that are not familiar with the foundation, it's really about scholarships for French and American students to pursue graduate business degrees on the other side of the Atlantic. Since inception in 2012, we've offered 75 $10,000 merit-based scholarships. In addition to Alicia, who I'd also like to thank very much for being here so early in her day to share her insights with us. We also have on the call some other foundation alumni, Jean-Jérôme Pétavy, Andrea Morière, Eden Abrahamian, and maybe some others, so big welcome to them. And I also wanted to share with you a few words from the FACC Foundation's president, Elsa Berry. Elsa wrote a letter to all of the foundation alumni and some of the other foundation constituents on April 27th, where she said, quote, I wanted to reiterate our commitment to supporting the next generation of transatlantic business leaders in the post-COVID-19 world, end quote. So whatever that world looks like, we are eager to ensure that young people continue to have life-changing study abroad experiences in France and the United States. This year we had the largest number of applications in the history of the program. We'll award 10 more scholarships this year to students whenever they are able to begin their classes, their MBA classes. So the program is going well. We are excited to welcome Alicia and to have all of you here this evening or this morning, depending on which side of the world you're on. And thank you very much again for being with us. I'll turn it back to John.
Well, Alicia, I will give it to you now and let you take over.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Martin. I'm very glad to be here this morning, 6 a.m. Beijing time. As was mentioned before, I'm an international strategy manager at the ride-hailing company Didi, based out of Beijing. I've been living in China for a few years now, around 4 or 5 years. And I just returned from the US where I completed my MBA. So originally I'm French, and it's been a great journey to kind of see different tech environments, both in France, in China, and in the US. So thank you again for all the team, and let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about different things. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Didi to you, what the mobility ecosystem is, how we went about international expansion, and a few initiatives that we conducted. And then I'm going to proceed into coronavirus and the kind of impacts it had on our business and how we mitigated those impacts and adapted. And last, I'm just going to talk about what it is to be a foreigner in Beijing during coronavirus crisis. So I think that this, you might have heard a lot about, the impact on Didi, on Uber and Lyft business during that crisis. But I'm going to try to spark a light to on what it is to live it from another country and from a company that you might be less familiar with. It is particularly relevant, the challenges that our industry is facing, because of course the business impact are huge, but also it poses an interesting questions about the gig economy model. So I'm very happy to talk about that. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me anytime. So first of all, let's talk about Didi. So Didi, it can be summarized as the Chinese equivalent of Uber. That would be the easy definition. And it's probably what we look like from the international business side. From the China domestic business, though, you would uncover some subtle differences with the Uber model that are related both to scale, the type of services that we offer, but also to the corporate culture and the way of conducting our operations in there. So first of all, let's look at the scale figures. So we have around 30 million drivers on our platform, both domestically and internationally, and around 550 million riders. So just to give you an idea of the scale, so Uber has approximately 5 million drivers and around 100 million registered users. Yeah, obviously there is the sheer scale of China adds another dimension. So in terms of transaction, obviously, we are actually the largest ride-hailing company in the world. So it's about 10 billion trips a year, if you can represent what it is. So that's a few tens of millions of trips a day. So indeed, that is a lot of transaction. That is a lot of data. And obviously, you need to make it possible on the ground and have the right system to process that amount of transactions. In terms of the services that we offer, it's pretty similar to Uber and other ride-hailing company, I'd say. We're going to have different categories of cars, different service level. I would say that one of the key differences is the way we approach working with taxis. So in China, we do have a lot of taxi drivers that are onboarded on our platform, not only private car drivers, but like official taxi drivers. And that was a way for us to, not endanger the livelihood of those drivers, because we represented quite a large chunk of the population in China. It's very easy to find a taxi in China in general. People are very used to taking taxi. Taxi is pretty cheap. It costs but maybe $3 a ride. So that's something very common in terms of penetration rate. So obviously the interests of that groups are paramount. And it's very important to keep good relationships with that group. So that's why we have so many taxi drivers onboarding, and our relationship with the taxi drivers are of very much importance to us. And then we also have other product categories that you may be less familiar with involved in bike sharing, which is huge in China. You could see if you go visit Shanghai or Beijing, armies of bikes parked in the street. It's a dimension that I've never seen anywhere else, and it's pretty commonly used as a way to commute between different metro stations. Because in a city like Beijing, I think Beijing is pretty much similar to LA in terms of urban planning. You add to that some better public transportation, but still the distance between two subway lines, it can be quite huge. So people usually use bikes to complete that distance, and it's very much used on campus as well at universities. We also venture into adjacent services. So we just launched food not long ago on our international markets, and we are also involved in financial services. Our financial services are mostly insurance products that we offer to our partner drivers to make them better protected. And we also have rental solutions. And among those rental solutions, we do have quite a lot of electrical vehicles. So part of our value proposition is obviously to make the life of our riders easier, to provide a livelihood to our drivers, but also to provide mobility solutions to the cities themselves. Engaging with city management and city government is extremely important in that business. So although on the paper we do look like a tech company where everything can be done online and remotely, it's actually not true. In the ground, you do need to engage with the regulators. You do need to engage what's top of your mind because they can essentially decide whether or not you operate in their cities. So developing a series of products that address their key concerns in terms of congestion and emissions was actually very crucial for business. So we've been integrating public transportation on our app so that people could choose between taking a ride or just using the public transportation, whatever is easiest for them. We also have, as I mentioned, clean energy offer that I'm going to dive into a little later in that presentation. And we also offer a smart transportation solutions. What does it mean? When you're doing ride hailing and you're processing, I don't know, 1 million rides a day in a city like Shanghai, obviously you get a lot of information about how the traffic situation is like, just by analyzing how much time it takes for your drivers to go from point A to point B, and you can then make an analysis over time, how is that evolving during the different days of a week, during the different hours of a day. And with that wealth of information, you can actually make a good prediction model of what the traffic is going to be, and kind of understand what's the influence of traffic lights on it. So we've been pioneering a system that allows to more smoothly regulate the traffic light based on the actual traffic. And we've been engaging with cities across China, but also in Brazil, to actually implement that type of system. Next slide, please, John. So here is a glance at how we went about expanding internationally. So Didi was created in 2012. That's about 3 years after Uber. We started off in Beijing. We quickly expanded throughout China, but it was pretty late that we actually ventured abroad, because our first international operation started in 2018, January. So you see there is a lapse period of 6 years. The reason for that was mostly just because China occupied a lot of our attention because it's so huge, right? Our international involvement have mostly been taking positions into other companies and investing in other local leaders. So we've been investing in Grab in Southeast Asia. We've been investing in Ola in India, in Bolt in Europe, and in Lyft in the US. So that's been a gradual process. Karim in Middle East as well. And we invested in 99 for the first time in Brazil in 2017, and that was really the first step into going abroad. So we decided to go to LATAM first. We officially went on in 2018, and that was through acquisition. So we bought the company called 99, that was #2 at the time in Brazil, and that's how we got a better sense of what the local problems were in terms of ride hailing in the LATAM region. Our international expansion mostly focused on the LATAM region for a while. It's a huge region, of course, growing very fast and presenting quite a few similarities with what we were used to, which is the China model of ride hailing. What do I mean by that? I mean, we are dealing with countries that are expanding fast. We have urban environments that are changing very fast as well. So urbanization is not completed yet, so you can ride on a wave of both urbanization, population growth, but also increase in the penetration rate of smartphone and mobile data. While obviously the situation in the US or in Europe would be different, right? So in those countries, people do care about how much it costs to take a ride, and they also do care about safety. So those were two key components of our value proposition. In 2008, we also decided to go into a totally unknown area, which was Australia, and we launched there mid-year. And then later in the year, we expanded to Japan. So obviously, those two countries have very different sets of mobility landscape and different issues that we encounter moving there. So the stage we are at right now is we haven't stopped our international expansion. We're still moving fast in LATAM. There might be other areas that we might decide to venture in the future, but let's see how it goes. So just to give you a sense of how large our business is internationally, we're talking about 22 million users. So as a reminder, including China, it's 550 million. So you can see the difference in scale between our Chinese and our international business. We're talking about around 1 million drivers present in 8 countries, mostly in LATAM, 260 cities, and that's more than 1 billion trips that we're completing from 2018 to now. So what are a few initiatives that we implemented as we were developing, both in China but also internationally? I think that, as I mentioned, most countries that we started to go to are quite price sensitive, right? We have a population that there is a middle class, but the middle class is still growing, and a lot of our drivers there actually come from pretty poor backgrounds. So being able to offer a low commission fee was actually critical in our ability to expand into those areas. So that's actually a key part of our value proposition. It's to make drivers earn more. So just to give you a sense of what the commission fee is on this industry, when you take the value of the rides, approximately 25% is given to Uber. In the US and Europe, it can be up to 30% of the value of a ride that goes to the platform, and the rest is going to go to the driver. For us, on average, it's around 10 to 15%. So obviously, that makes a lot of difference in terms of earning potential for our drivers. It's relevant. Why? Because when we started off in China, most of our drivers, they were really poor. They come from relatively poor backgrounds. That's for the one who actually choose to work full time, right? Some of them they decide to ride to drive part-time, and they have other full-time jobs. But some of our drivers, they come to Beijing, they come to Shanghai from the countrysides just for the earning potential. So that does matter a lot. Then there obviously they are what we would call gig workers, and that's the case for all of the countries that we are operating in the sense that they're not formal employee, but there are some tools that we put in place in order to help them in their daily lives. So we do have an emergency funds for the driver that have serious illness or have accidents while driving or faced with natural disaster, and we also support the education of their kids. So through scholarships that we deliver to their kids so that they can go to middle schools and high schools. One key part of our CSR engagement as well is ensuring female empowerment. Why do I say that? So it's kind of a buzz thing to say, right? But in our case, we are looking for drivers, obviously, and in some cities, drivers availability is limited, so we might not find the number of drivers that we do need to operate at a good service level for our passengers. So if I give you an example, for example, Beijing. In Beijing, it is what we could say a market with not enough drivers. So at the peak times, you can wait a very long time to actually get a ride. So in some countries, Uber solved that problem with surge pricing and increasing by a lot the price for a ride, but this is not allowed in China. So essentially, you have to wait, and we have a waiting list and a very different features that allow people to stay on the wait list, choose a different car categories, skip the queue if they want to tip the driver more because this is authorized. But obviously, if you find a way to engage more drivers, then you can partially solve that issue, right? So finding more female drivers is actually critical for our business. It's also critical because the earning potential for those drivers is actually pretty high compared to other economic opportunities that they might have. And it's also a flexible work, which does matter for female drivers, especially single mothers. So we have about 10% of our drivers in China who are women, about 17% in LATAM. So it does seem low, right? And it is low if we compare it to their male counterpart, but that's a figure that is growing, and we're actually actively campaigning to grow that number. So in terms of earning potential, you don't have an employer in the HR department that is going to decide of whether or not you deserve a higher wage because you have a better negotiating power. It's a marketplace, so the pricing is going to be transparent, be you a woman or a man, and it's actually the number of time that you spend on the platform that is going to impact your wage. It's also the tips that people are going to give you, and on average, our female drivers tend to have better ratings than our male drivers, so they can have a higher earning potential as well. How to accompany those women into taking a driver role, because there is a lot of stigma around being a driver, and one of it is safety, especially in LATAM country. So for us, it's very important to accompany our female drivers and give them the kind of training that they might need to face some situations that might happen, and we also provide insurance coverage. So that's for Didi. It's a quick introduction of what we're doing. Obviously, we're a large company, so there are lots of initiatives that we're involved in. But I'll be happy to know if you have any questions. Don't hesitate to ask. I can pause here and take the time to answer that.
Perhaps anyone that wants to ask a question, if it, as Alicia is speaking, could write it in the chat, and then we can pass them along. Thank you.
Actually, Alicia, I do have a quick question that kind of leads in nicely to this. What precautions will U.S. regulatory authorities and/or corporate owners of ride-sharing businesses need to take to protect the health and welfare of drivers and riders in the post-COVID world? And what can we learn from China and Didi in that regard?
Yeah, that's a key concern, right? We've been hearing that a lot, both in the U.S. and in Europe. We talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the platforms because our business essentially crashed when people stopped moving around. But for drivers, it's real, right? It's like their earnings that vanish. And for bread earners of their families, they end up having nothing left. So that's, of course, a concern. So that's why we set up a few emergency funds, as I'm going to mention before, later on in the presentation. There have been a few debates on whether or not we should change the status of the drivers and give them more of an employment contract. I'd say that in developing country, the debate is slightly different. There is no debate in China over should you give a working contract to a driver, and the reason for that is there is still a concept of there is a large chunk of China population that is still living on a day-to-day work, which we call dagong in China, which means that you just go to the city and you're looking for a daily job, and maybe the next day you're gonna be looking for another job. So when you have still maybe 10-20% of the population that is living that way, out of the formal, I would say, employment scheme, then of course you won't have the kind of debate that you find in Europe or in the United States, because that's pretty much a normal in China's life. So of course, it doesn't mean that we should do nothing for our drivers and we should not support them. That's what we did. We have, again, emergency funds for that. We do provide insurance coverage for most of our drivers on a basic level. And then we do sell a few other insurance for them. We've been working hard on decreasing the costs of car ownership as well, through a few leasing options that we can offer them, so that they would be able to make more earnings by reducing the cost rate. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing. It's not necessarily just are you an employee or are you not an employee, but how can the platform actually take actions into making their earning potential higher. That also leads me to another point, which is if your main business tumbles, how good of other opportunities can you provide to those drivers? So Uber has famously set up that new platform where they help their drivers find other jobs. We've been doing the same. So some of our drivers, we could actually, in the the most hit areas from the epidemics, they could actually drive for the medical staff, and we would take care of all the expenses. For some others, we offer job opportunities, and we also develop new product lines that adapt to the unique situations of a quarantine. So I'm going to talk about that a little later as well. All right, so what are the impact of a crisis like coronavirus on a ride-hailing business? So you may have heard of the figures that were stated by Uber. In some cities, they have more than 90% of their business that crashed. In general, I would say it's anywhere between 50 to 90% less business, so less rides and less transaction volume, depending on how severe the lockdown measures are. Some cities, they actually suspend the service. So usually it's on a voluntary basis. We do decide to suspend the service. But if we do consider China, for example, we had a dual situation. So China, as you may know, the epidemics of the coronavirus is in a province that is called Hubei, which main city is Wuhan. So Hubei was it's approximately the size of France, to give you a scale, and this province was locked down starting end of January and recently opened up end of April. But for the entire period, it was completely locked down. Lockdown means that people can't really go out to do jogging, as was a lot debated in France, whether or not you should authorize them to do so, and should it be 1 kilometer or 3 kilometers. Lockdown in Wuhan city means that you cannot leave your apartment building, and that the government actually has to put some measure in place so that you can still be given food, just because you have no way to actually leave your apartment building. So that's what we were talking about. So essentially, the only people who are authorized to be wandering in the streets, it's to go to work, and those were medical workers. So we got an exception for some of our drivers, so that they could help those medical workers to actually go to the hospital. And that's where we set up that special fleet of volunteer drivers to actually drive the medical workers. Why do I say volunteer? They volunteered to do so. It's not all of the driver pool that we had in the city, because obviously there is less need for drivers, but those drivers have all of their expense covered, and they volunteer their time to actually be driving the medical staff. A second thing that we did is to provide electrical bikes to those to this medical staff who would decide that they prefer to be riding on their own, so that we gave them the opportunity to do so as well. That's Wuhan and Hubei province. Then we have the second situation. The second situation is essentially the rest of China. Since Wuhan and Hubei region have been on complete lockdown starting end of January, it also means that the progression of the epidemics was pretty slow, or much slower in other regions of China, meaning that a complete lockdown was not necessary in those cities. Still, the government put in place a lot of very restrictive rules in order to for business to operate or for people to move around. But still, it still means that people were free to actually wander the city. So if people are free to wander the city, then they still have a need for mobility. And if they do, we as a business, our responsibility is to ensure that they're going to do it safely. So we had to put in place very fast a lot of different protocols on how to disinfect the cars. So we created mobile stations to actually be doing it, and fixed station to be doing it. So we had some staff whose main role was to make sure that all cars and all bikes were clean as many times as possible during the day. Another thing that we did was to check on the health of our drivers. What does that mean, and what is it important? Of course, it's our responsibility as a company partnering with drivers to make sure that they have the opportunity to be checked if they need to. When I'm saying check, it's not like a test of coronavirus. We're talking about temperature checks that is performed by Didi staff on specific stations that the drivers have to go to every morning. And then they can report any symptoms or the evolution of their condition several times during the day on an app. So they would have to report their temperature several times during the day in the app. And then we set up a masks and gloves mandatory policies for our drivers, and for the riders, masks were absolutely compulsory. And drivers were instructed on how to clean the car after the passengers went out of the car, and that kind of things. The last type of measures that we did implement in China was to offer job opportunities for drivers. Of course, you cannot offer job opportunities for all of your drivers when you have 20, 30 millions of them. But for some types of drivers, we're able to offer fixed, like permanent opportunities. And that's what we did for a veteran, military veteran. So we offered around 15,000 jobs for the veterans, who represent around 10% of the drivers on our platform anyway. And we were able to offer them full-time drivers opportunity on our premier and luxe car categories, but also they could get positions as operation staff for bikes. Then what did we do internationally? Because the crisis hit us twice, right? It hit us starting end of January in China. And then as the situation in China was still not settled, we were hit on our international markets, starting at, say, probably end of March, April. So we applied essentially the same playbook that we did use in China. We set up a relief fund to provide emergency help to our drivers, mostly drivers that are infected or suspected of being infected. We have a Didi Hero program, which is the transportation of our medical staff, and we did a lot of protective equipment donation. So we've been handing over millions of masks to obviously our drivers, but also medical workers in different cities that we operate in. One of the key aspects of protecting our drivers and reassuring our riders about the safety of our trip was to finance the installation of protective sheets in the cars. So it doesn't look very beautiful, as you can see. That's that plastic wall in between the passenger and the drivers. But I think in terms of safety feeling, it's actually very important. Drivers, they need to feel that they're not risking their lives when they're driving for you, and passengers are going to be encouraged to go back on ride hailing only if they feel that there is a limited risk to do so. It's actually very important. So we set up that fund to buy those protective sheets, and we helped the driver install it. We also did a few tweaks on our apps. In LATAM, you can actually pay by cash on your rides. You can pay by card, but also by cash. Obviously, it's not advisable in a time like this one, so we disable that function. As we launched food delivery in some cities in Japan and in LATAM, we followed the example of the food delivery companies in China that set up new processes to avoid any contacts between the delivery person and the person that ordered a meal. It works more or less well depending on how the residential complex are organized. So in China, the residential complex are pretty much, you would have a lot of apartment building within the same park, and there is an entrance gate to that park. So it's very easy to prevent people from entering or living. And what the residential management company did is that they set up those shelves where the delivery people would just leave the meal or anything that they deliver, and then they would go to ensure less contacts. And then, as I mentioned, we did have to change a few of the business lines that we were operating. We're suspending our carpooling business line. That's the thing you have to do, right? It's you have to operate safely. We launched Didi Food, but we also launched Didi Tasks in Australia, where the driver can actually complete a set of different tasks that you might have for him, and that keep him occupied during the day and can increase his earning while the number of rides is obviously going down. So that's for Didi and the mitigation measures that we adopted both in China and internationally. Now the last part of my talk is going to be about what is it to live in China through COVID-19. Obviously, there is a lot to say about it, but I'm just going to try to give you a few examples and anecdotes. So in China, as I mentioned, it's a conditional quarantine. It's not like a national lockdown. Some areas were completely locked down, others were not, and Beijing was not, for example. That being said, it doesn't mean that it's easy to go around and it's easy to continue doing conducting your life the way you usually do. So during starting February, actually, the government started to put in place a quarantine measure for any person that would go into Beijing city from outside, be it another Chinese city or be it internationally. So you would have to stay home for 15 days, as most of you might be familiar with. If a person has been infected in your apartment complex, then you also have to go through a mandatory quarantine. So it was funny to see that, here on the picture, you see people just throwing out boxes from the fence. That's actually something that you could see on a daily basis. And you can also see lovers like talking to each other through different sides of the fence, just because they had no way to see each other for an extended duration of time. So application of quarantine measures are quite strict in China. And this is linked to the fact that, as I said, most apartments, they are in those apartment complex where you have only one entry, or it's very easy for the management to control the entries. So they're going to ask you who you are. They're going to check your temperature. They're going to ask you to provide a proof that you do not come from an outside city and you are still in Beijing or in Shanghai during the whole time. And you have to provide the green lights that you're not being infected. So how does the government control whether or not you're being infected? Through different ways. One is systematic testing for anyone who's been suspected of having coronavirus. Systematic testing happens in areas that were not in complete lockdown. I'm in Shanghai, I'm in Beijing, I'm in other major cities. In Hubei region, there were so many cases that it was impossible to test every single person. But in other regions, it was actually possible to isolate where the source of the contamination may come from, and to isolate all of the people that might be infected. So the government put in place a set of different apps to actually track you. So they have partnerships with all of the telecom companies, and you just need to press a button, and on the Beijing Health Kit, for example, and the operator is going to send the information of where you've been in the past 15 days. Where you've been in the past 50 days, not a complete list of the different shops and stuff you've been to. It's more, have you been in Beijing, or were you outside of Beijing? And that's the green light you need to go to any supermarket, to go to any shop. So yeah, you don't have a choice. And you need to register some personal information on paper. That was a very tedious process wherever you go. Then there is social distancing. What does that mean? This is a factory floor, but I think that Didi canteen looked like that for quite a while. So they would just reorganize the entire office setting so that they would minimize your contact with other people when it was decided that company could start reopening. So that happens in March. For one and a half month, we had to work exclusively from home, and then we could finally come back. But yeah, it's not as usual, right? You have to eat alone. You have to eat from a lunchbox, etc. And then a lot of people are working from home. And surprisingly enough, I did realize that a lot of people in China enjoy working from home. In cities like Beijing, where urban planning is complex, and it can take you an hour and a half to 2 hours to go to work one way, a lot of people enjoy the flexibility of working from home. Last, I want to give you an illustration of what you do more with less in China. So I don't know if you heard about China's pragmatism, but this is an illustration of it. So in the US, in Europe, you had a lot of debates about the role of governments in non-providing people with masks, right? And you've heard a lot about, oh, China has been stealing the masks of the entire world. But there was a mask shortage in China as well. And I think that there is a different mindset in China than in other countries. And like France, for example, people are not expecting the government to be delivering masks to them. They're going to try to find them on their own. And if they cannot, then they're going to be very imaginative about what they can do to protect themselves. So in France, the adoption of masks is not very common, right? People are reluctant to be wearing them, but in China, you would produce masks with whatever you get. So you can see people have been using like water containers, have been using water pomegranate, what's the name of that fruit? I forgot, pamplemousse. They've been wearing nappies for babies. They've been wearing huge plastic bags that they rub themselves on to protect themselves as much as they can. So there wasn't so much of a discussion about what's the standard of a mask they've been using, but just try to do what they can to feel safe. And they don't care about their looks that much. All right, that's all for today. So I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have about Didi, about China, about coronavirus. Feel free to ask me.
Well, Alicia, we do, I think the most pending question that we've been getting, and I think everyone wants to know the answer to, and I think you might be able to help us, is how is COVID-19 going to change the ride sharing, ride hailing, and I mean, you could even branch that out to the gig economy as a whole.
Sure. I think the impact on ride hailing is it's an immediate financial impact, right? So you either move now or you don't move at all. It's not going to be a delayed purchase, right? So if you lose the sale now as a company, you're just going to lose it for the entire year and you have to deal with it. There is no delaying it by 6 months and then people will compensate. They don't. And that's pretty much the same for restaurants, right? So for us, how do you survive that as a company? It means you need to have a good cash position. There is no secrets about that. And that's why Uber has been one of the first things they did when the crisis started to be severe in the United States and the government started to announce potential lockdown. The first reaction of Uber CEO was to reassure investors about the cash position of Uber and the fact that under different scenario, criticality scenario, they could draw on their cash reserves to go through the crisis. So for Didi, it's pretty much the same. Is do you have a good cash position that allow you to go through the crisis as long as it takes? Then do you have an after crisis plan? And that after crisis plan is it's more or less how are you going to compensate for what you didn't have. Obviously, there is no direct compensation. That means that you need to find other businesses to expand into, yeah, so those are the kind of things that you're going to have to do. As I mentioned, for the gig economy model, I do think it makes a lot of sense in US and Europe. It makes less sense in developing countries just because a lot of people, they work outside of the legal framework for work, so there is not so much of a concept of gig economy or not. For the developed countries, and we are in Australia, so that also touches us, right? I think it's a matter of providing the relief funds that you can at the time it's needed, but it's not doing anything, right? I mean, it's not doing everything, right? For the long term, it's ultimately it's a matter of is that service needed or not in a specific country? If the answer is yes, then chances are that even though there is this crisis, the regulator is still going to think twice about putting too much requirements on you and what is needed and what is not needed. There are two aspects. One is what offers convenience for the passengers and do they have other options to travel? So if in Europe they do have a lot of public transportation options to travel from, that's not necessarily the case in all of the cities in the US, right? Just because the public transportation infrastructure is very different. That's one point. The second point is your drivers. So if you take the specific example of France, for example, a lot of our drivers in Paris region were unemployed before. I mean, I say our drivers, but it's gig economy drivers and Uber drivers because we're not in those regions. But those people who were unemployed before. A lot of them, they come from, they're second generation immigrants hit by high unemployment rates. They live in the suburb of Paris, and essentially driving for Uber was maybe their first stable job opportunity. And that sounds like a lot of PR and fluffy, but it's actually true. So in some cities, driving for Ubers is actually a stable employment opportunities for those drivers. And while they're driving and making legit earnings, they're not engaged in other activities that create troubles for the government, illegal activities, and so on. Those people we're talking about, most of them, they're young men, right? So they could potentially be involved in other activities that would be less stable and less legal than driving for Uber. So those are the kind of considerations that local government take, and that's why some local governments are friendly in some cities, and in some cities where it's less needed, both for drivers and passengers, they tend to be less friendly towards the gig economy. So I think it's gonna be a local solution as often in this business. It's very hard to generalize on where is going to be. Is it going to be the end of a gig economy model? No, it's not going to be the end. Does it mean that we should put more emphasis on how much our drivers are making on a daily basis and not just through this crisis? Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, for the sake of time, as a last question, are there any management practices you are seeing in China that US and European companies could maybe replicate that would help a company prepare for a potential second wave?
Sure. So you have to communicate a lot with your employees to raise awareness on what we call like the barrier measures. It's very easy to forget them, especially as you go, as time passes. You're like, oh, do I really need to stay at that specific location in the elevator, or do I need to wear my mask all the time? I'd say that it's the management responsibility to make sure that people are aware of what the risks are and to remind them when they are forgetting it. So one way Didi managed that is they put a lot of visual signs everywhere, just like in factories floor for the lean management technique. It pretty much looked like that. So you can orient the flow of people, and you have a lot of like posters that remind what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. Delaying the return to work as much as possible is obviously key. So for us, the first week we started work, we were only 20% of the employees. So you have to organize rotations, right? And then we went 30% and then 50%, and now we're finally back to full scale. But that was also critical. So enabling the employees to work from home as long as possible is actually a key part as well.
Okay, well, I want to thank you so much, Alicia, for the presentation and for taking the time to go through all that. I will give just a very quick word to those watching. Tomorrow we have one of our lunchtime series, Tasting Through France, and then next Monday we have Talking Me with Ariane Dagan. But Alicia, I do just want to thank you once more for not only taking the time, waking up quite early your time to speak with us all, but giving a very in-depth presentation to all of us. To the attendees, the presentation itself, the recording, the slides will all be available. But if you have any questions or anything concerns, or anything you'd like to discuss, shoot a message over to membership@facc-NYC.org or find us social media. Alicia, thank you so much once more. I know that we will be in touch once more to talk about how things are developing over there and if there's anything we can learn. Let me just quickly see. I think that will do it for us. I just want to thank all the attendees for coming, and Alicia, I hope to speak with you soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was great. Have a good day, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.